Hi folks, in a previous video I discussed how potentially distributors are losing control over the video game market, and today I found this really interesting article that said former Square Enix executive on why Final Fantasy sales don't meet expectations and chances of recouping insane AAA budgets. And so the former Square Enix executive in question is Jacob Novak. He was a director of business at Square Enix Holdings for, I believe, over a decade. And in a recent tweet, he posted this, a thread on the recent Square Enix news regarding FF sales numbers and expectations. And so he basically replies to this article in general made by IGN on why exactly didn't Square Enix expectations were met when it comes to the sales of Final Fantasy Rebirth, Final Fantasy 16, and Foam Stars. I'm going to try to point to some of the things that Jacob says that I find really interesting overall, since this tweet is rather extensive and we could stay here for like 40 minutes talking, because that's what I did in the last time I tried to actually record this video. But essentially, he talks about here how the decision making when it comes to budgets for these games was essentially done during 2015, 2016, right? And so the budgets for these games were not taking into account what would happen in the next few years of the gaming industry. And so what he says here is that we have to basically take into account that this is a pre-Fortnite era when it comes to creating the budgets for Final Fantasy VII Remake and into Rebirth and all that sort of stuff. And this is huge. He claims here that there's a misunderstanding that has been repeated for nearly a decade and a half. The Square Enix sets arbitrarily high sales requirements, then gets upset when its arbitrarily high sales requirements fails to be met. And he basically points to this forum by called Resetera, where a lot of people are talking about this. They spend 100 millions and even more on AAA games, and then they're surprised they don't sell 10 million units in 3 months. That's a general sentiment in the video game industry as a whole in general from a lot of players. He says if a game costs, let's say, 100 million to make and it takes 5 years, then you have to bet, as an example, what the business could have returned investing 100 million into the stock market over that period. For the 5 year prior to February 2024, the stock market averaged a rate of return of 14.5%. Investing that 100 million in the stock market would net you a return of 201 million. So this is a return on investment baseline. Right. So from what I understand from this is essentially the baseline return on investments that you need to make in order to make a profit. So that would be if you make that investment of 100 mil over 5 years, you would need a return of 200 mil in order to get some sort of return on investment base, right? But the problem with this is that can the game net a return higher than this after marketing, platform fees, discounts, all factored in, right? So that base stuff is just the base stuff. It's not putting all of this into account. So he gives an example. The $70 that the consumer pays only returns $49 after the 30% platform fees. I've talked about this in the other video. Platforms take a huge percentage of these games. It's insane. And platforms will generally get a recoup of any funds spent on exclusivity, meaning until they are paid back, they will keep that cash. Plus, discounts start almost immediately. I do wonder though, because I can clearly understand why companies might have a lot of trouble with this like 30% platform fee, especially for like platforms like Steam and all that. But maybe I'm not understanding something here, because Final Fantasy had this partnership with Sony, like for the exclusivity deal. So I'm assuming that Sony probably either helped fund the video game in question, right, because of that exclusivity deal. I mean, or they simply don't have to pay at least those types of platform fees, right? I don't know. There's something here that doesn't make sense to me. Maybe I'm missing something. I tried to like search about the Sony Square Enix deal when it comes to exclusivity to see if something would surge, but I couldn't really find anything. But I find kind of weird because, I mean, if Sony is helping Square Enix to bring a PlayStation exclusive game into their platform, you would assume that, either Sony would help fund the company in question, or, you know, taking 30% fee would be kind of insane. I don't know. Maybe I'm not seeing something here. But I think it's, regardless, I think it's still being made pretty clearly, which is like, for example, if you assume the marketing expenses is at 50 million, which is really high. Marketing gets a big cut when it comes to like game development in general for these types of AAA budget games. And assume that you're not going to get like 49, but rather on average closer to $40, given discounts, returns, and other aspects. Now, let's say that in the first months you sold 3 million copies with $40 of net received. You need to surpass 254 million to make expectations. That's 100 million plus 101 million in return on investment baseline, plus 50 million in marketing. So from his estimates, at 3 million copies with $40 per copy received, you've only made 120 million, and you're far off. Okay, I mean, if his estimate is correct, then, I mean, yeah, absolutely. That's a very low amount of money to be made for a game like this if you're going to spend like $100+ million for it. And there's no way that 3 million can cover that. There's just no way. This is not to say that Final Fantasy 16 was a flop. It barely managed to cover the base expenses for the game, right? Or at least that's what it seems like. Jacob also points to a post made by Takashi Mochizuki. He's a reporter, I believe, for Bloomberg, and I think he says something that is very interesting here. So essentially, Square Enix is being reorganized, and I think that's a good thing in general. And it has been he claims that Square Enix has relied too much on individual creativity. We'll promote sharing game making how among teams, and we'll seek best balance of individual creativity and organizational discipline. I think what he's trying to say here with a more softer version is that there was too much power for one person in terms of the creative process, I guess, and it feels like they're going to partition that a little bit more. That's what it feels like. I do think that this is actually the main point that he's actually trying to make here, which is that's not even the core of the problem. This is just me proving that expectations aren't set immodestly. The core of the problem is that the budgets were set in a period where the expectation was that the audience would grow. And that audience is still there, and it's still growing for video games. The problem is the budgets for these 3 video games specifically was made back in 2015, 2016, from what we are understanding by Jacob. If that is the case, a lot changed during 2016 and 2018 with the releases of games like H1Z1, PUBG, and Fortnite. And the problem is that those 3 games and more games that came along shaped the new generation of gamers, especially like the Gen Zs and the Gen Alphas that are coming up now. It molded them on how they perceive video games, and it's probably in a very different shape that we millennials, for example, see video games. And he even mentions exactly that here. What's happened, not just to Square Enix, but the industry as a whole, audience behavioral patterns are radically different than expected in 2015. And 2015 is pre-Fortnite. And he continues, the way it used to work was that you'd pick your release date similar to a Hollywood movie, stick to it, and consider the competition to be the titles releasing the weeks before and after. At that time as a gamer, once you finished the most recent game you were on, you moved on to the next. You were looking for your next title once you finished the prior one. We wanted one of our titles to be the next title you bought to fill your game needs. This world radically changed in the last 6 years. How many live service games have millions and millions of players these days? It's Minecraft, it's Roblox, it's Fortnite, it's Call of Duty, it's Valorant, it's Counter-Strike, and it keeps going. Dude, actually, this one actually made me sad when I read it the first time. This post that he put it right after, which is a guy in Kotaku posted an article of saying 9 great games we can't stop thinking about, and the top on the 10th position was Fortnite. And he writes this on an article. Once again, another weekend arrives and I realize that I'll be spending most of it playing Fortnite. I'm very close to maxing out both my battle pass and festival pass. So that's the plan. And he kind of says here how he's kind of sickened by himself because of that mentality that he has, right? And the problem is, sure, I think a lot of millennials do have this sort of mentality now, but I think it's affecting the newer generations a lot more than the older generations, which is probably normal. And that's his main point here. Square Enix are not competing against just the latest installments. They're competing against every free-to-play online game that is constantly adding content and getting more and more robust over time, right? So before, and that's, I've talked about this, right? I've talked about this. Like, I'm the type of gamer that I'm so used to I don't like to stay in one video game all the time. I like to move. I like to go from one game to the next, because that's how I grew up with. That's how I just perceived things. I have so many CDs of just a bunch of video games that I bought, right? I try demos, I try everything, and that's how I still prefer to play. I don't like to stick to one game. Sure, I've played a good amount of, Counter-Strike, Valorant, and all that sort of stuff. I don't deny that. But the problem is the video game industry is not like that now, right? Apart from having to constantly dealing and battling those new entry games that are coming up, you will still need to fight against these free-to-play games that have been around for at this point 10 years, that have been developing and getting more and more robust, like you say. And it's like, it just becomes incredibly hard to make new games that are good these days, right? And even if they are really good, like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a phenomenal game. And the fact that it just didn't sell, it's insane, right? But it is what it is. The market competition for attention is incredibly high right now. Like, it's super hard to gain attention from new players these days, because millions and millions of them already have the game that they play, right? But with Fortnite and Warzone, they never get old. They're constantly adding new stuff, content, and experience, and they will continue for decades to come. Candy Crush is insane. Like, he actually puts this article here. Candy Crush Saga hits 20 billion revenue milestone. Let that goddamn sink in, man. Let that sink in. 20 billion. It's not million. Billion revenue. King is huge. It's insane how huge this thing is. It's crazy. He makes a very scary comparison here, actually, with social media. There are very few competitors to Facebook. Once the network effect starts, it can keep going for a long time. Folks, we might be seeing a bunch of just video games completely monopolizing the entire industry, and that is very scary. I'm not gonna lie to you. If you have like 10 games that monopolize everything, essentially you just have like a bunch of social media apps that are gamified. That's basically, that's what it feels like. God damn it. I don't like the future for the video game industry as a whole, man. I'm not gonna lie to you. I mean, to be real, like, there's always going to be space for new video games to come up and making a ton of profit, right? But the problem with Square Enix is that they thought that they could get more and more revenue if they put in more and more money, right? But what they are feeling is that they've reached a ceiling of what they can actually get in terms of revenue. That's the issue. I don't doubt that Square Enix is still going to do Final Fantasy games and all that sort of stuff. The problem is that they might have to decrease the amount of development time, the amount of money they're putting, all that sort of stuff into their new Final Fantasy franchise, right? And who knows, we might be actually seeing a shift into like live service games that are part of Square Enix, which would not surprise me at all, unfortunately, if they haven't already done that, to be honest. Yeah, and he keeps going with this. If you're a gamer with disposable income but less free time, and you have the choice of paying $70 to play 100 hours of Final Fantasy 16, or just continue playing Fortnite with your friends for free, which one will most people choose? They will definitely choose Fortnite to play with friends for free, because there's just a lot of people that don't have enough money to even buy a $70 game, right? And this is something that I always found fascinating. The first iPhone, when it came up, right, for example, it cost like, what, $500 or something like that? The newest entry of the iPhone costs like what, 1K or something like that. It's crazy, right? You would assume that the newer technology would become cheaper, but it seems like it became a lot more expensive. And that's just in general for like smartphones and all that sort of stuff. But in the video game industry, that doesn't seem to happen, which is very curious. The PlayStation is still roughly the same price, or the consoles are still roughly the same price. And video games honestly haven't really changed much in terms of pricing. It was like, what, $50, $60 all the way to $70. I mean, it is already very expensive, a video game $70, but it's just the way that we perceive value into something in general, right? We just simply don't perceive, like, or the vast majority of people just don't perceive $100, for example. You would not buy a video game for $100, though you'd probably spend $20 a month for a battle pass, or $15 or $10 a month to play World of Warcraft for 10 years. Go figure, man. It's kind of weird. I don't know. I'm not saying I agree that games should be $100 plus. I'm just saying that it's hard to understand sometimes the position of people in general. We just don't know, man. It's curious. I do agree a lot with this, and Hellblade is a very big example. He says that this is an example of this is the reason we see trends where games are either spectacular 10 out of 10s or just complete failures and a disaster, and this polarization makes risks higher and costs higher too. This is like incredibly true. Hellblade 2 has been a massive example on that, right? People have been completely trash talking Hellblade 2. Honestly, in my opinion, it has its reasons. I can understand a lot of it, but I honestly don't even feel like a lot of people that are trash talking the game have even played the game like for 5 minutes. So it's kind of like, okay, if you actually played, you would understand what they were trying to achieve and how brilliant they were to achieving that. Does the game have problems? Absolutely. Combat is really bad. Exploration could be better. Puzzles are really annoying. Cinematic wise, a triumph in my opinion. But you know, people are just constantly saying Hellblade is shit when it's not. It's not a shit game. It just isn't. And you haven't played the game if you think that way, in my opinion. This is another point that I've touched a lot about Final Fantasy, which is if you're a younger gamer in your teens, you probably haven't even heard of Final Fantasy. And I've talked about this. Final Fantasy has lost relevancy in the last 10, 20 years. And the main reason for that, or one of the reasons for it, is that if you check here, how many games have been released from Final Fantasy in the last 15 years? In the last, like, in this time frame of 1987 to 2002, 11. If you check, for example, from 2009 to 2023, we had 4 games, because this is like the same game, right? Final Fantasy 14, it's different, but you'll get what I mean when I say this, right? It's essentially 4 games. And one of them was Final Fantasy 13, which is probably the worst one in the franchise. And 15 also didn't really... It did a few things really well, but it was received kind of negatively when it came to gameplay, exploration, all that sort of stuff. It was greeted with mixed reactions in general, right? So it's kind of like, man, like if you don't release games, how do you want to keep being relevant in the industry? That's just going to be really hard in the long run, man. This is the reason every publisher chased live service titles. Audiences clearly gravitate towards them, and profits followed success. The old AAA franchises do not seem to be converting the younger generations that the industry was counting for growth, and instead, free-to-play social games on mobile are where they spend their time. And here he supposedly says that there are reports that the cost of development for Spider-Man 2 was almost $400 million, which is crazy. So he says here also that development costs have gone up and switching costs of the consumer has gone up. And as a result, companies have to invest even more because it has to be a 10 out of 10 or gamers will stick to Fortnite or similar products. FF7 Rebirth with a 92% Metacritic rating can't get the sales it needs. So these factors mean that the status quo must change. And so he claims that there are 3 levers you can pull to make the equation work for return on investment at a game company, which is decreasing costs, increase price, or increase audience size. So increase the audience size doesn't seem reliable. Yeah, even mentions like right after. Yeah. Meanwhile, on the cost side, inflation is up, salaries are up, and consumers require sophisticated, beautiful products to get them to fork over cash rather than to keep them playing free-to-play titles. So that is insane. So the struggle right now for these video game companies is actually to take them off of these like free-to-play games, titles, and actually play brand new games. That is insane to me, man. What the hell happened to this industry? Yeah, he mentions here, and very well, how basically indie games, because a lot of people might tend to talk about indie games a lot. How can a video game company with 100, 200, 300, 400 employees make a disastrous game, and a dude makes Balatro and succeeds, right? But the problem is the sales are not that high when compared to like what Fortnite is. Second, the case for Balatro is 1 in a million. That's the problem. You only really know about Manor Lords, Balatro, and Undertale. You don't talk about the 99% of games that actually flopped. That's the problem. You don't talk about those, man. And there's a lot of them. Most of them are flops. That's the problem. Yeah, and as I said before, he basically mentions how the only thing that kind of is left is to leverage the price up. And you can already see a lot of video games doing this, or at least there's reports of GTA 6 pulling up the price past $70. There's also Star Wars Outlaws that supposedly some of these editions are pumping all the way to $110 and $130. There's also the case for Assassin's Creed Shadows, which is already putting the price at $100 and $130. So, and he's mentioning how it's not because game companies are penny pinchers looking to fleece their users, because this is the only path left to make non-free-to-play services titles workable in the AAA space given cost and competition, because they're not only competing against each other, they're also competing against free-to-play games. That is insane. He also mentions here how there could be another path, which is basically to increase the take rate of if publishers can capture more from on the platform side revenue. So for example, if Steam actually decreased the amount of revenue that they take from, I don't know, 30% to like 20 or 15, potentially that would be a lot better for the company in general to actually succeed and keep going, right? Steam getting 30, I'm going to say this again. Steam getting 30% cut is fucking insane. Maybe I'm not seeing something again, but it's crazy that they get 30% off of every goddamn game on Steam. It's insane for sales. Yeah, and this is also a reason why you see so many companies actually opening their own stores or platforms, right? Because they kind of want to avoid that middleman. As I've mentioned before in a video, they want to avoid that middleman on the relationship between the company and the buyer, right? For example, they want to avoid Steam and not being able to get that 30% cut. 30% cut is a lot of money. I believe I saw a report that said that just in 2022, those platforms got all the way up to $41 billion just for getting those cuts of all the video games in the industry. It's insane. So yeah, sorry, this video is way too long already. I'm also thankful for Jacob to doing this report, because I feel like a lot of people, and especially YouTubers in the community here, just trash talk these companies. And I mean, to be fair, there's a lot of trash talking about these companies that is definitely deserved. But a lot of the times we just don't fully comprehend why do they make these decisions. It's obviously because of money, but that is like it feels like a very basic sort of response, right? Okay, it's money, but what's more into that? And I feel like I need to, as a YouTuber at least, or trying to be like a content creator, I think that's one of the things that I'm going to try to pursue a little bit more on this channel, is trying to understand exactly why are they pursuing these sorts of decisions. Why is Square Enix trying to go out of why is Square Enix trying to go multi-platform and all that sort of stuff, right? And man, it's not easy, dude. I love Final Fantasy, but the truth is, if they want to pursue their passion dreams, their passion projects, right, they need to make money in order to sustain themselves, in order to bring whatever the next Final Fantasy is and their visions to light. One thing is for sure, this market right now for video games, it feels like the competition is very rough right now. It is insanely rough. It's tribes going to war, it feels like, with empires in the middle. But yeah, if you like video games and art in general, subscribe.